Professor Phillips, and we're going to do our video lecture over our chapter on local government. So, oftentimes in political science and teaching of political science, we don't talk about local government near as much as we should. If you've paid much attention to me this semester or taken me before, I talk a lot about how important local government is and what happens at the local government level affects us more often than what happens at the federal level. All you have to look at right now is, the crisis that we're going through with coronavirus. We're seeing most of the leadership coming from our local governments as far as, should we shelter in place? What businesses can stay open? Our governor has pretty much kind of shifted that responsibility to local government. So it's very important to talk about them, and it's very important to make sure that we get out and vote in local elections because this affects our school districts, our tax rates, a lot of things that we tend to not think about. So, first, we'll talk about the authority of local government. So, the US Constitution doesn't really talk about local government, but the 10th Amendment gives the authority not given to the federal government is reserved for the states. Um, Dillon's rule was established in 1868, which essentially said that the states have authority over municipal government, county government, and can regulate it and put, rules and restrictions in place as long as they don't violate the state constitution. Now, here in Texas, we see our state government kind of go back and forth with local government, especially, our state government is still very conservative Republican, but our biggest cities tend to be democratically controlled. If we look at Dallas, Houston, Austin, San Antonio, these places are controlled by the Democratic Party. And so the state government and the local governments of our biggest cities tend to have a kind of push and pull, love hate relationship because of their difference in politics. Local rules and local law we tend to refer to as ordinances. And so within a city limits, a municipal government has the authority to set rules, regulations, and most of these will be put into place by city councils and things like that. Local government can regulate policy within its city limits, provided that the state has not already made rules about those things. A couple of examples here. When Uber and Lyft and Airbnb and apps like that were starting to take off, there were some cities who didn't like that these new ways of doing business were kind of coming in and taking business away from cab companies that had been around forever, hotels, and things like that. So some cities have, started putting regulations on Uber and Lyft if they want to operate within the city limits. Airbnb, one of the big things was when you stay at a hotel, you pay a lot of taxes. It's like an occupancy fee and a resort fee and all this kind of stuff, and that's how city and county government makes revenue from tourism. But Airbnb in the beginning wasn't paying these taxes, and so local government has started to step in and tell these companies if you want to do this type of business here, you're going to have to comply with local regulations as well. Now, provided that the state allows for Uber, Lyft, Airbnb, and these things to operate within the state, local government can't really tell them they cannot, but they can make sure they are complying with local ordinances, especially as it pertains to tax revenue. Now, Texas is one of the, we're the second largest state when it comes to land mass. We are the third largest state when it comes to population, and we have more counties than any other state in the country. We have 254 counties, which means that we have 254 individual county governments. Now, county governments are different than municipal government. County governments essentially are administrative arms of state government that make sure local entities are complying with state law. County governments will enforce state public safety regulations, collect taxes for the state, run jails for criminal punishment, all that kind of stuff. Um, but the counties are, there's county designation, and then within municipalities, cities, they, control these types of things within their city limits. We'll talk about some positions and how they differ between the two. In all counties, there's what we call unincorporated area. Unincorporated area is land that is still not part of any city or town. And so, if that land is not under the authority of city government, then county regulations are the ones that will govern that land. And those rules are established by state government. County tends to be less flexible and more rigid because it is under state control. Municipalities can kind of change their laws as they need to, especially to keep their citizens happy. Each county is governed by the county judge and the commissioner's court. If you remember in our court section, we talked about this group. They're called commissioner's court, and they're headed by a county judge, but they don't actually hear cases. What they do is they manage county affairs, things like crisis management when there's a natural disaster, setting tax rates for the county, overseeing the county budget, all those types of things. And then our county sheriff is the chief law enforcement officer for the county. They enforce the law, especially in all of that unincorporated territory. Where each city will have its own police department, but in those areas where where that's not part of a city or a town, the sheriff will handle law enforcement. The sheriff's department will operate the county jail. They serve warrants and court papers, all that kind of stuff. Typically, they try not to be law enforcement within a city limits area because they want to reserve that for the police. But if they're called in or they're needed, they will do that as well. The sheriff is a unique individual because the sheriff is part law enforcement. Most of their duties are law enforcement duties, but they're also part politician because they have to run for office, they have to campaign to get elected to keep their job. And then all of the other officials that work in the sheriff's department are known as deputies, and they are the ones that help the sheriff carry out their responsibilities. A few other really important county officials to talk about. County prosecutors. These are our county attorneys, district attorneys. They are prosecutors for the county that represent the state. They are the ones who, especially in a criminal case, have brought charges against someone who has broken the law and is arguing for conviction and punishment. At the county level, we have some administrators that are very important, the district clerk and county clerk. The district clerk may serve a wider area for our district courts. The county clerk serves just within the county limits, but they are all record keepers. The district clerk manages passports, child support payments, records hearings. The county clerk is where we go when we need to get our marriage license, birth and death certificates. And they also the county clerk, like we said, will make sure that our elections go off with no problems. County finance, there's a tax assessor that most people will hate because they are the ones who collect our taxes for the state. Auditors who make sure that county funds are being spent appropriately. And some counties may have a treasurer, but the treasurer position has widely been eliminated and their responsibilities have been rolled into the other two. But they would manage payouts from the county, checks that are sent out, all that kind of stuff. Now, city government is the one that most of us are familiar with. There's two different types of cities in the state of Texas. There's general law cities and home rule cities. A general law city is a city or town under 5,000 residents. These are our really, really small towns. They don't have a lot of self determination. They essentially are the rules that govern these small cities. Most of them are established by the state legislature. And if they want to change things, they have to seek the permission of state government to do so. Home rule cities are ones that are larger than 5,000 residents and exercise a lot of self governance independent of the state and how they run their city. Um, this in 1913, we had regulations put into place that the state allowed home rule cities to elect city councils, annex additional land, set their tax rates, create policy for themselves as long as it doesn't go against the state or the United States Constitution. And each home rule city will have a charter, which is kind of a governing document that just establishes how they're going to structure city government, rules, all that kind of stuff. So here in Fort Worth, we would be a home rule city. All of your large cities would fall in that category. Uh, sorry, city government, just like a state legislature and the federal legislature, they pass bills, or they pass policy and things like that. They just use different terminology. Initiatives, these are things that local voters have a lot of influence at the local government level. And this is why I say that we should pay a lot of attention here because you really can influence local government quite a bit. But if a group of local voters want to see something happen in their city, they can propose an initiative. And it's essentially proposing a new rule or regulation or something like that. And it works on a petition system. If you can get enough signatures based on whatever the criteria is that your city has set, you get enough signatures on your petition for your initiative, and then it will go on the ballot come election time. And the citizens can vote on whether they want to adopt that initiative, and it will become law or a city ordinance. Referendums tend to work the opposite way. Let's say that a rule or regulation has been put in place and we don't like it and we want to get rid of it. The same process can happen. You can start a petition to essentially repeal existing ordinances. If the city council will not agree to rescind them, put it to the voters. And if enough people agree, then you can rescind a city ordinance. Many city governments allow for recalls. We don't have this at the state level, but if, say, in a city, people are not satisfied with their city councilors or their mayor or things like that, they can start a petition to recall that person from their position, which would essentially, it's kind of like a citizen impeachment to remove someone from a position that people aren't happy with the job they're doing. Cities also, your home rule cities also have the ability to annex additional jurisdiction as the city grows. DFW, it's one of the fastest growing areas in the United States. I think DFW as a whole is the fourth largest metropolitan area in the United States. And as more people come here, we'll need more land to support those people. And so there's an area outside of the city limits called extraterritorial jurisdiction. And this can range from half a mile to 5 miles, where a city can annex that territory and make it part of the city. So, why would a city want to do this? Well, if you have more people coming into a city, they're going to be using city services, city resources, polluting the air, using the roads, all that kind of stuff. And so you need more tax revenue to support more people. And so you can annex more territory, you can develop it for business, for residential. There may already be people living out there. And so it brings them into the tax base to help support the city. Now, people obviously who live outside the city limits typically don't like this process. They moved outside of the city limits for a reason. But if we think about it fairly, those people who live, up to 5 miles outside of the city, they're probably coming into the city for everything they need, whether it's to buy groceries or for entertainment, whatever it is for their job. and they bring negative things with them, like air pollution. They use our roads. Maybe they use the education system, for their children, but they're not contributing to the tax base. So it brings them in and makes them responsible for the city as well as everyone who already lives in the city limits. Now, there's a few different ways that cities will choose to set up their government. The oldest is the mayor council system. This is where we have an elected mayor and members of an elected city council, and the mayor serves as the chief executive. But there's two variations here. The strong mayor system is where the mayor has legislative and executive powers, meaning they can veto, things that are passed by the city council. They can appoint people to certain positions, and they also get to cast a vote as part of the city council. This is the oldest system of city government in the United States, and we still see this in a lot of our big old East Coast cities like New York, Boston, places like that were original colonies. Um, there's also a weak mayor system where the mayor essentially has no veto, no appointment powers, um, and they essentially are just kind of a figurehead and a member of the city council. Here in Fort Worth, we have a mayor, Betsy Price, but she is kind of a figurehead where, the mayor represents the city, travels to promote the city, all that kind of stuff. But essentially, they're just another member of the city council, just with a little more attention put on them. And then all the other offices of a city's executive branch will be elected. Um, Mayors and local government tend to be a little less partisan than state and federal. But this system, the mayor council system, is viewed as being very 19th century and being outdated. And so today, most governments use this system, the council manager. Um, in this system, we may still have a mayor, but they will be a weak mayor. But the city council is making all of the decisions. They are passing the budget, allocating money, all that kind of stuff. But in this system, the city council will hire a city manager. And a city manager runs the day to day operations of the city. They are the chief administrator and they execute the budget. So the difference here is if you have a mayor in charge of a city, a mayor doesn't have to have any experience or knowledge in how to run a government. They just have to get elected. In this system, a city manager is going to be a highly qualified, educated individual who probably went to school and got a degree in policy, political science, public administration, something like that, on how to do this job specifically. They'll probably have at least a master's, sometimes a PhD, and they probably have a lot of experience in doing this, working their way up from small cities, small towns, up to a large major city. And so they are highly educated in what it takes to run a city, execute a budget, and all that kind of stuff. Whereas anybody can be elected mayor, whether you have experience or not. And so most big cities prefer this system because of that specialization of the city manager. They know what they're doing. They're given the authority by the city council to enforce city regulations, supervise all the employees of the city. They execute programs, allocate the money for the budget, and bring things to the attention of the city council that need to be addressed. The city council and the mayor will set the policy, set the rules, decide how much the budget will be each year. But again, the mayor in this system is mostly symbolic. They're just kind of a figurehead that represents the city. Today, 90% of home rule cities, so any city over 5,000 residents, will use this system in our country. Now, there's one other weird system that came about in Texas in the 1900s, and that is the commission style of government. This was established in Galveston after the hurricane of 1900. So there was this big, massive hurricane in 1900 that pretty much destroyed the city of Galveston. And the citizens felt that the council was taking too long getting the city going again, that they couldn't agree, they had to take votes and all that, and it was just slowing the process down. So in this system, instead, they appoint a commission to make these legislative and executive decisions for the city, and they are made up of the heads of each major department. Like you may have waste management, parks and recreation, the school district, all these different departments. So they would form a commission with the head of each of these departments who would then, decide on taxes, spending, creating rules, all that kind of stuff. And so these individuals were appointed based on the position that they held within their department. So you did have educated individuals with experience and expertise in a particular area, and this worked really well. Galveston got rebuilt very quickly. But once the crisis was over, this turned out to not be such a great form of government. One criticism was that it disenfranchised citizens. So if citizens wanted a change in the commission, they weren't given an opportunity to vote because each person got their job by virtue of being the head of their department. It was argued that a commission system was too business friendly and that they were too easily corrupted by being, bribes and political favors. And also, when it came time to do a budget, each person obviously is going to want the most amount of money for their department. And so this system, after a few years, definitely showed that it was not the best way to run a city. Now, another form of local government is a special district, and these are single-purpose governments that exist for one purpose or a very specialized set of reasons. So, some examples: school districts. Independent school districts exist to educate students. You have college districts. Each college or university has its own police department, its own kind of little community within the college or university, hospitals, medical districts, and then sometimes when you live outside the city limits, little communities will form a special district for their utilities, like making sure everybody gets electricity, water, that kind of stuff. And then probably the most well known is the Homeowners Association, probably most well known and most hated. But the Homeowners Association exists to help homeowners maintain the property values of their home by ensuring that everyone that lives in a particular neighborhood adheres to certain guidelines as far as changing your property, what color you can paint your house, maintaining cleanliness and all that kind of stuff. And you agree to be in one of these associations when you buy a house in that particular neighborhood. Now, a lot of people hate homeowners associations because they have to pay dues and they have a lot of control over what you can and can't do to your property. But the idea is that they keep property values high by ensuring a certain quality all the way across the neighborhood. And all of these special districts will have a board that oversee, their governance, make rules, make sure people are following the rules and things like that. Um, like I said, HOAs are the most controversial, though. The state has had to step in and create some legislation as it pertains to HOAs because there were some that were being found to they were not holding open meetings. They were not announcing when meetings were taking place. They were not keeping records. And so there was, the people who lived in the association didn't really know what was going on all the time. And so now in the state of Texas, they have to notify community members when meetings are happening, what changes have been made, and all that kind of stuff. At the local level, elections function a little differently. County elections pretty much operate like state elections. There's county judges, the commissioner's court, sheriffs, all of those individuals. They typically serve 4-year terms. They'll be on the ballot, during a normal election season. City government is a little different. And so there's a few different ways that cities will elect their city council, and they're usually kind of staggered so that the city council is not up for the entire thing is not up for election at the same time. Now, city council uses what is called a place system to determine how people can get elected to the city council. There's a couple of different systems here. First is the at large system. At large means that any person, as long as they live in the city limits, can run for a city council seat. Some cities use this, but in most big cities, this works for a small town. When you have a 10,000, 20,000, size town, the city's just not that big. So in an at large system, each person would represent the whole city. Now, in a big city like Dallas, Houston, places like that, these cities tend to use a single member district, which means that the city is divided into districts and you have to live in that district to run for that city council seat. And the advantage here is that you're going to be represented by someone who looks like the community you come from. And so they're going to know that community, know what its issues are, and advocate for that community because that's where they also live. And so that's why big cities tend to favor this system because it gives each part of the city a voice and representation on the city council. Some places, like out in California, have been experimenting with a cumulative system where, you cast a total number of votes, like each voter may get, if there's, say, 4 seats open on the city council, each voter gets 4 votes, and you can allocate them however you want. You can rank your choices, like I like this person first, second, third, fourth, or you can give all 4 of your votes to one person if you feel that strongly about it. So there are some other ways of doing this that are being experimented with, but they're not really taking place here in Texas. Now, the biggest problem with local governments is the low voter turnout. Sometimes local elections happen kind of off season from other elections. And so, in a lot of local elections, only about 10 to 15% of voters are turning out to vote, which means that 10 to 15% of the city is deciding who's going to govern the city. And that's why I say it's very important for people to get out and participate in these elections because what happens at this level of government will affect you on a day to day basis. Now, what are some of the problems with local government here in Texas? One of the biggest, and we've talked about this a little bit this semester, is revenue. Where do cities get their money from? Well, cities get about 27% of revenue from the sales tax and 37% from property taxes. Property taxes accounted for about $50 billion in city revenue in 2015. The problem, though, is here in Texas, a lot of money to support different things like education, city improvements, things like that, have to come from property taxes, but property owners do not want to pay higher property taxes. So the local governments, their hands are kind of tied when they need to pay for something, but citizens are not willing to pay more in property taxes. In Texas, we don't have the income tax, so pretty much the only thing we can change on a year-to-year basis is the property tax. And even at the state level, there are some very conservative politicians trying to put a cap on how high cities can raise property taxes to about 2 to 2.5%, which would kind of tie their hands as far as where they're going to get their money from. And so, all the services that we demand from our local government, they have to be paid for by somebody. So that's one of the problems we're seeing. Debt. We talked about how Texas doesn't like to go into debt, but cities can borrow money too, whether they need to fund projects or, expand, things like that. The voters have to approve what are called bonds. It's essentially the city asking your permission to be taxed higher to pay off debt that it may incur for certain things. A good example of this is Arlington. Every time they build a stadium, they put a bond on the ballot, and voters essentially will be paying on those stadiums through their tax revenue for a very long time. The trade-off is that those types of things are supposed to bring tourism to the city and will increase, business in the city, and so sales tax will be bringing in significant revenue, things like that. So there's a trade-off there. But if a city makes a bad call, and let's say they build, I don't know, like here in Fort Worth, they built the Dickies Arena. So let's say that, Fort Worth, paid for that big stadium to be built, but then they couldn't get any big name artists booked there for concerts, then it doesn't pay off the way it's supposed to, and the city is in extreme debt. And so that's something that cities have been struggling with. We've had a few cities come very close to defaulting on debt because they've made some bad decisions. Plano dealt with this, earlier in the 2000s. So they have to be very careful about where they are incurring debt and whether they can pay it off. And then sprawl. This is something that is a big deal here in DFW. The idea is more and more people are coming to this area. Um, you know, it continues to expand out into areas of undeveloped land. So, whereas, 10, 20, 30 years ago, you could drive around DFW and there were large gaps of just open land between a lot of cities. Today, that's not the case. So many of the cities in DFW have grown to the point where they all just run together into one massive metropolitan area. And so, as the cities continue to expand, we're using up more and more natural land that is undeveloped, resources, and things like that. Um, some other issues that we've been seeing recently: zoning regulations. Zoning regulations exist to keep the city divided into certain areas. So if a part of a city is zoned commercial, that means that businesses exist there. If it's zoned residential, that means that that's for homes to be built and things like that. What we're seeing a lot of, especially in DFW, is what we call mixed use zoning, where we have all these shops on the bottom and we have apartments up on the top, and the apartments are very expensive to the point that your average person can't really afford them. And in a lot of places in Texas, big cities, those apartments are sitting empty because just the cost of what people want to charge for those things. People in Texas aren't used to paying that much for an apartment. So there has been some, this has backfired a bit. The idea was it was going to grow business in the city and people would like to live where the nightlife is and things like that. But it hasn't worked out that way everywhere in the state. Houston is the only major city in the entire United States without strict zoning regulations. So if you drive around Houston, you may see a regular home next to a business, next to a skyscraper, because they don't have zoning regulations the way the rest of the cities do. Um, Pensions are something that is causing a lot of problems for Texas cities right now. A few years ago, this started happening in Dallas and Fort Worth and Houston and places like that, where when you take on a very difficult job, whether it is being a police officer, a firefighter, an EMT, things like that, if you work for the city, a lot of times those positions get promised a pension. And the pension is essentially a guaranteed retirement where you will be, once you retire, you get so much per month to live on and you get health insurance and things like that. And this is all paid for by the city because of the dangerous job you did for your entire career. Well, when cities started expanding and growing, they started dipping into these pension funds to pay for other things and not paying the funds back. And so now we have a lot of baby boomers that have retired, Gen Xers, that are starting to retire, and these cities didn't anticipate the sheer number of people that were going to be retiring, and so now their pension funds are short. Uh, as of about 2016, Dallas was $5 billion short on meeting its pension obligations. Houston was $6 billion short, and Fort Worth is about $1.2 billion short. And now they're asking these people who have already gotten to their retirement age, to live on less money. They've gone to the state to beg for help, and the state has said, this isn't our problem. You messed this up on your own. And so we don't know where this money is going to be made up. Pensions get funded through taxes, But voters do not want to increase taxes to make up these pension differences. So right now, cities are struggling to figure out how they're going to deal with this issue. Council of governments are just, it's when all of the cities in an area come together to solve local issues. So here we have the North Central Texas Council of Governments, where all of the cities in DFW come together to share ideas, share resources, all that kind of stuff. Because if something happens in Dallas, it's likely going to affect Fort Worth too, and vice versa. So the cities here are so close together that they can't really view themselves as separate entities. So this Council of Governments essentially helps all of those municipal groups work together to solve local problems.